The 6 best James Bond villains and the 5 worst ScreenRant. A good film is only as good as its villain. It also goes from Sean Connery to Daniel Craig. Each Bond actor has had his fair share of brilliant and terrible adversaries, and this will carry on until someone decides to call it quits on the long-running spy movie franchise. However, click the button below to start this article and quick view. Jaws, who was played by Richard Kiel in both The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, is easily one of the most memorable Bond villains, and it's not just because of those steel teeth. He appeared in 2. Gustav Graves, played by Toby Stephens, was Bond's adversary in the Pierce Brosnan-led Bond film, Die Another Day, and this villain was terrible. There's no other way. If you ask someone with even a shred of Bond knowledge to name one villain from the franchise, Oddjob's name will be one of the ones which will undoubtedly come up. Oddjob was there's nothing worse than being forgettable when you're the villain of a Bond film, and that's precisely what Matthew Amalric's Dominic Green was. It's virtually there's nothing else of note to say about Green. He was a poor villain. Robert Shaw's Red Grant is basically Bond if he had been working for the Soviets. He's suave, yet another totally forgettable villain. Tomorrow, never. If you see Sean Bean in a movie, odds are he's going to die. So, it was pompous, annoying and arrogant. Moonraker's Hugh, he's also overshadowed by Jaws in the movie, who's far more interesting. There's nothing worse. There have been so many iterations of Blofeld throughout Bond history. Christoph Waltz, Joe Don Baker played Brad Whitaker in The Living Daylights, and there's never been a character as miscast as this one. Whitaker, a milf. Obsessed with gold, Goldfinger killed Pussy Galore by covering her in melted gold, which is yet another display of the man's fiendishness. No other Bond villain. Who are your favorite and least favorite Bond villains? Let us know in the subscribe for the hottest movie, TV, and gaming news. I agree to let ScreenRant send me emails.
Raindrop, drop top smoking, no cooking the hot pot. Fucking on your bitch, yeah, that. Looking up, open the park pot.